You may have called yourself an empath because you feel what other people feel, but that is only part of the truth. The more uncomfortable truth is that you learn to carry what other people refuse to feel for themselves. You absorbed their tension before they admitted they were angry. You softened your voice before they accused you of being difficult. You entered a room and immediately adjusted yourself to whatever emotional atmosphere was waiting there. You thought this sensitivity made you compassionate. Sometimes it did, but sometimes it made you disappear. Carl Jung spent decades studying the unconscious patterns that cause one person to become entangled with the inner world of another. He understood that what feels like extraordinary empathy can also become a form of psychological captivity. When the boundary between your emotions and someone else's emotions remains unconscious, you do not merely understand them. You begin living on their behalf. You anticipate their disappointment. You regulate their anger. You carry their unspoken grief. You rehearse conversations that have not happened because you are already preparing to protect them from the emotional consequences of your honesty. Eventually, you become exhausted without knowing exactly what you have done. Nothing dramatic may have happened. No visible crisis explains the heaviness in your body. You may have spent the day answering messages, listening carefully, reassuring someone, smoothing over a disagreement, or sitting quietly beside a person who refused to name what they were feeling. Yet by evening, you feel as though something has been taken from you. This is because something has. Your psychic energy has been distributed across every person whose inner state you believed you were responsible for managing. The strange part begins when you stop. When you stop carrying everyone's emotions, you do not simply feel lighter. You begin noticing things you could not see while you were busy absorbing, translating, and neutralizing the emotional lives of other people. Patterns become visible. Relationships change shape. Silence begins to speak. Your own anger returns with information. Your intuition becomes quieter, but more accurate. You begin to realize that many of the feelings you once called yours never belonged to you. Jung described a condition called participation mystique, a psychological state in which the boundary between yourself and another person becomes blurred. You do not experience the other person as fully separate. Their mood enters your body as an instruction. Their approval feels connected to your safety. Their discomfort feels like evidence that you have done something wrong. This condition is natural in early childhood. A child depends on the emotional stability of the adults around them. If a parent becomes distant, explosive, unpredictable, or overwhelmed, the child cannot simply conclude that the parent is struggling with their own unconscious material. The child assumes responsibility. You learn to read footsteps in the hallway. You learn what kind of silence means danger. You learn whether a door has been closed normally or with restrained anger. You learn to study a face before asking for anything. Sensitivity becomes survival. Later, you may call this gift empathy. You may even receive praise for it. People describe you as understanding, calm, emotionally intelligent, or easy to talk to. They tell you that you always know what to say. They come to you when their relationships collapse, when their fears overwhelm them, or when the consequences of their choices become too painful to face alone. What they may not notice is what happens inside you after they leave. A woman sits on the edge of her bed after a long phone call. Her friend has spent an hour describing the same destructive relationship she has described many times before. The woman reaches for her phone to send one more reassuring message, then stops with her thumb above the screen. She realizes that her chest is tight, her jaw is clenched, and she is more frightened about her friend's future than her friend appears to be. This is the hidden burden of unconscious empathy. You do not merely witness suffering. You continue suffering after the other person has returned to their life. The pattern remains invisible because carrying emotions gives you a role. It tells you who you are. You are the safe one, the patient one, the person who understands, the person who does not make things worse, the person who can tolerate what others cannot. But the role has a cost. The more identified you become with being the emotional container, the less room remains for your own experience. Your sadness feels inconvenient because someone else is suffering more. Your anger feels dangerous because it might disturb the fragile balance. Your desires feel selfish because pursuing them may disappoint someone who has grown accustomed to your availability. Jung warned that whatever remains unconscious will shape your life and appear to you as fate. If your need to manage other people's emotions remains unconscious, you will repeatedly find yourself surrounded by people who need managing. You will call it coincidence. You will wonder why emotionally unavailable people trust you. You will wonder why chaotic people feel safe around you. You will wonder why your relationships begin with intense closeness and end with exhaustion. The psyche is not punishing you. It is repeating the pattern until you become conscious of your participation in it. When you stop carrying everyone's emotions, you first notice how often other people expect you to rescue them without asking directly. They may never say, "Take responsibility for how I feel." They do not need to. The demand arrives through hesitation, withdrawal, implication, or disappointment. A sigh becomes a request. A delayed reply becomes pressure. A change in tone becomes a signal that you must investigate, reassure, explain, or apologize. You have been trained to respond to emotional suggestion. Jung understood that unconscious communication is often more powerful than spoken communication. People project their disowned feelings into others. A person who cannot tolerate their own helplessness may behave in a way that makes you feel urgently responsible. A person who refuses to acknowledge their anger may become cold until you feel compelled to repair the atmosphere. A person who cannot face their own shame may accuse you of being uncaring. Before you developed a boundary, you accepted the projection. You felt their helplessness as obligation. You felt their anger as your guilt. You felt their shame as proof that you had failed them. A man receives a brief message from his brother. "Forget it. I'll handle it myself." He reads it several times, searching for the accusation beneath the words. His hand moves toward the call button, ready to explain why he could not help that evening. Then he places the phone face down and notices what is happening. His brother has not asked a question, but his disappointment is already controlling the room. When you stop responding automatically, you see the structure of the interaction. You notice that some people communicate their needs by creating discomfort and waiting for you to remove it. What you once called compassion was sometimes obedience to emotional pressure. This realization can make you feel cruel at first. Your nervous system has confused boundaries with abandonment. When you do not rush to repair someone's mood, your body may react as though you have placed the relationship in danger. You may feel restless, guilty, or physically tense. You may compose long explanations in your mind. You may imagine the other person telling someone that you have changed. The discomfort does not prove that your boundary is wrong. It reveals how thoroughly you were conditioned to experience another person's unhappiness as a command. Then you begin noticing that silence is not always peace. For years, you may have interpreted the absence of conflict as evidence that a relationship was healthy. No one shouted, no one left, no one openly rejected you. Yet the peace existed because you consistently removed anything that might create tension. You withheld your disappointment. You translated your anger into understanding. You accepted explanations that did not satisfy you. You said, "It's fine," before deciding whether it was. Jung treated conflict as an unavoidable part of individuation. To become a distinct person, you must eventually collide with the expectations that were built around your compliance. The ego wants harmony because harmony feels safe. The deeper self wants truth, even when truth disrupts the arrangement. This does not mean every feeling must be expressed impulsively. It means genuine peace cannot depend on your self-erasure. A daughter visits her mother on a Sunday afternoon. Her mother makes a familiar comment about how rarely she visits, even though they saw each other the previous week. Usually, the daughter laughs softly and promises to come more often. This time, she lets the comment remain unanswered. The clock ticks above the kitchen doorway, and for the first time, she notices that the silence does not contain sadness alone. It contains punishment. Once you stop filling every silence, you begin hearing what the silence was designed to make you do. Some silences invite reflection. Others enforce submission. You notice the difference because you are no longer rushing to relieve the tension. You let the other person remain responsible for what they have chosen not to say. You stop translating withdrawal into your own failure. You stop volunteering confessions simply because someone has become distant. What you once called emotional awareness was often your fear of what might happen if another person remained uncomfortable. As your energy returns, you begin noticing the presence of borrowed guilt. Borrowed guilt feels morally serious. It tells you that a good person would do more. A loving person would answer immediately. A loyal person would stay longer. A compassionate person would understand one more betrayal, forgive one more broken promise, or postpone one more personal need. But true guilt follows a violation of your values. Borrowed guilt follows a violation of someone else's expectations. Jung distinguished between the social mask and the deeper personality. The persona is the identity you develop to remain acceptable within your family, culture, or relationships. Your empathic persona may be gentle, endlessly patient, available, and emotionally spacious. It earns belonging by asking very little. The shadow then collects everything the persona excludes. Your irritation goes into the shadow. Your hunger for privacy goes into the shadow. Your wish to be cared for goes into the shadow. Your refusal goes into the shadow. Even your ordinary selfishness, the healthy instinct to protect your time and pursue your own life, becomes something you cannot admit without shame. A woman receives an invitation to spend her only free Saturday helping a relative move. She has already worked 6 long days and feels exhaustion behind her eyes. She types, "Of course, what time?" Then she deletes the message. For several minutes, she stares at the blank screen, while guilt rises in her stomach, not because she has harmed anyone, but because she is considering herself. When you stop carrying everyone's emotions, guilt often becomes louder before it becomes weaker. This happens because guilt was the leash attached to your persona. It pulled you back whenever you moved toward separation. It reminded you that belonging had conditions. Be useful. Be easy. Be available. Do not become too complicated. Do not ask others to adapt to you. The return of guilt does not mean you have become selfish. It means the old identity has detected that it is losing control. You are not betraying your values when you disappoint someone. You are discovering whether your values were chosen freely or installed through fear. You also begin noticing how many people were attached to your emotional labor rather than your actual presence. This is one of the most painful discoveries. Some relationships appear deeply intimate because people tell you everything. They reveal their wounds, fears, family histories, secret resentments, and private crises. You may mistake disclosure for mutuality. You feel trusted, needed, and emotionally close. But intimacy is not measured by how much someone is willing to unload into you. Intimacy requires curiosity about your inner world. It requires the capacity to remain present when you are inconvenient, uncertain, angry, quiet, or in need. It requires another person to tolerate the fact that you exist beyond the role you perform for them. Jung believed that genuine relationship becomes possible only when projection begins to withdraw. As long as someone experiences you primarily as the healer, rescuer, ideal partner, wise friend, or endlessly forgiving listener, they are relating to an image. They are not yet relating to the whole of you. The same may be true in reverse. You may experience them as the wounded person who needs your understanding. Their need gives you significance. Their dependence protects you from the risk of asking whether they can truly meet you. A man sits across from a friend in a quiet cafe. For years, their conversations have revolved around the friend's career frustrations and unstable relationships. This time, the man begins speaking about his own grief. Within minutes, the friend checks his phone, changes the subject, and begins describing another crisis. The man looks down at his untouched coffee and understands that he has not lost the friend's attention. He may never have had it. When you stop performing emotional usefulness, the relationship reveals its actual depth. Some people become curious about you. They adjust. They ask questions. They recognize the imbalance and try to meet you differently. Others become irritated, distant, or confused. They say you are colder. They accuse you of overthinking. They remind you of how supportive they have been. Even if their support consisted mainly of appreciating your support, their reaction contains information. What you have been calling rejection may be the collapse of a role that never allowed you to be fully present. Then your anger begins to return. This can frighten you more than sadness. Sadness feels compatible with the empathic identity. Sadness can be quiet, tender, and understanding. Anger is different. Anger separates. Anger names a violation. Anger says, "This belongs to you, and this belongs to me." You may have spent years converting anger into empathy. Whenever someone hurt you, you immediately considered their childhood, their stress, their trauma, their fear of intimacy, or their limited emotional skills. Your interpretation may have been accurate, but understanding why someone harmed you does not remove the fact that harm occurred. Jung did not treat the shadow as something evil to eliminate. The shadow contains the rejected life force of the personality. When anger has been exiled, the shadow becomes the keeper of your boundaries. It waits beneath fatigue, resentment, numbness, and unexplained withdrawal. Your anger is not always asking you to attack. Often, it is asking you to recognize. A woman listens while her partner explains, once again, why he forgot something important to her. She can already feel herself preparing to say that she understands how busy he has been. Instead, she looks at the floor and notices heat spreading through her chest. She does not shout. She simply says, "You keep explaining the reason, but you have not acknowledged the impact." This is what integrated anger sounds like. It does not need cruelty. It does not need revenge. It needs language. When you stop carrying the other person's defensiveness, you can finally remain with your own experience long enough to name it. You no longer abandon your pain the moment someone explains themselves. You no longer comfort the person who hurt you because they feel ashamed after hearing what they did. What you once feared as bitterness may be the psyche's refusal to keep forgiving what has never been repaired. Your intuition also changes. Before, intuition may have felt loud, urgent, and obsessive. You sensed a shift in tone and immediately began searching for meaning. You noticed a delayed response, and felt certain something was wrong. You detected tension in a room and could not rest until you identified its source. This may have seemed like heightened perception. Sometimes it was hypervigilance. Hypervigilance asks, "What must you do to remain safe?" Intuition asks, "What is true?" The difference becomes clear only when you stop assuming responsibility for what you perceive. Jung viewed intuition as a psychological function that perceives possibilities and underlying patterns. But when intuition becomes entangled with fear, every pattern feels like a personal obligation. You do not merely notice that someone is upset. You believe you must fix it. You do not merely sense dishonesty. You begin searching for the explanation that will allow you to tolerate it. Clear intuition does not always produce urgency. Often, it produces stillness. A man enters a family gathering and immediately notices tension between two relatives. In the past, he would have become entertaining, helpful, and unusually talkative, trying to lift the atmosphere. This time, he takes his seat and continues eating. He notices the tension, trusts that it exists, and allows the people who created it to decide what to do with it. When you stop carrying everyone's emotions, you can perceive without absorbing. This is a profound shift. You still notice the clenched jaw, the forced smile, the answer that arrives too quickly, or the sudden coldness in someone's voice. But the perception no longer enters your body as an emergency. You are allowed to know that someone is upset without making their upset your assignment. As this distinction strengthens, you begin noticing your own emotions with greater precision. For a long time, your inner world may have felt confusing because it was crowded. You could not tell whether the heaviness belonged to grief, exhaustion, resentment, fear, or the emotional residue of the people around you. Everything blended together. You may have asked, "Why do I feel this way?" and found no answer, because the feeling did not begin with you. Jung's work repeatedly returned to the necessity of differentiation. Psychological maturity requires distinguishing conscious from unconscious, persona from shadow, projection from perception, and self from collective expectation. Without differentiation, you cannot choose. You can only react. Emotional differentiation does not make you less sensitive. It makes your sensitivity usable. A woman leaves a crowded dinner and sits alone in her car. Usually, she would drive home with a vague sense of sadness. This time, she remains still and traces the evening carefully. The sadness began after her sister described feeling trapped in her marriage. The woman realizes that she is carrying fear for a life she is not living. This recognition does not make her indifferent. It makes compassion possible without possession. You can care about another person's pain while refusing to build a home for it inside your body. You can listen without rehearsing solutions all night. You can love someone who is disappointed in you. You can witness a person's grief without making promises that violate your limits. What you once called detachment may be the beginning of emotional honesty. Then you notice how often people prefer your empathy to your truth. Empathy makes others feel understood. Truth sometimes makes them feel exposed. When you offered understanding without limit, people could remain inside their patterns while still receiving the comfort of being seen. Your presence relieved the emotional pressure that might otherwise have forced them to change. This is difficult to accept because you wanted your compassion to help. Sometimes it did, but sometimes it protected another person from encountering the consequences of their choices. You listened to the same complaint without asking what they intended to do differently. You reassured someone after they repeated a behavior that harmed you. You explained their motives to other people. You absorbed their remorse. before it became responsibility. Jung understood that growth often begins when a familiar adaptation stops working. A person encounters the limits of the persona, the relationship, or the life they have constructed. The resulting discomfort creates the possibility of consciousness. When you immediately remove that discomfort, you may interrupt the process. A father calls his adult son after another financial crisis. In the past, the son would send money, calm his father's panic, and quietly reduce his own expenses. This time, he listens without offering rescue. His father becomes angry and says, "I thought family helped each other." The son notices the old guilt, but he also notices that his father has not asked how the repeated crises affect him. Refusing to carry the consequence does not create the crisis. It reveals who has been carrying it. This is where your empathy becomes more demanding, not less. You stop confusing love with prevention. You stop preventing people from feeling sadness, frustration, shame, uncertainty, or loss when those feelings belong to their own decisions. You respect their psyche enough to let it communicate with them. What you have been calling abandonment may be the first time you have allowed another person to meet their own life. But beneath all these discoveries lies a more uncomfortable truth. Carrying everyone's emotions did not only protect them, it protected you. As long as you were occupied with their needs, you did not have to confront the emptiness created by neglecting your own. Their crises gave your days urgency. Their dependence gave you identity. Their gratitude gave you temporary proof that you mattered. Without those emotional assignments, you may feel strangely directionless. You may wake up and realize there is no message to answer, no conflict to interpret, no wounded person to reassure. Instead of relief, you may feel restless. You may even miss the intensity. This does not mean you want suffering. It means your nervous system has associated emotional labor with connection. Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious a descent, because the old identity cannot accompany you intact. The empathic persona may have been admired, useful, and morally convincing, but it also allowed you to avoid questions that could not be answered through service. What do you want when no one needs anything from you? What do you feel when no one else's emotions are available to organize your attention? What relationships remain when you stop earning your place through understanding? These questions may uncover grief. You may grieve the years spent explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You may grieve how often your body signaled exhaustion while you continued offering warmth. You may grieve the version of yourself who believed that enough patience could transform another person's unwillingness into love. You may also grieve the fantasy that everyone will celebrate your growth. Some people benefited from your lack of boundaries. Your healing changes the emotional economy of the relationship. The person who once discharged anger into you must now carry it. The person who relied on your reassurance must confront their own uncertainty. The person who used your flexibility must encounter the limits of your availability. They may not describe this change accurately. They may call you distant because you are no longer emotionally fused with them. They may call you selfish because you have become visible. They may say you are difficult because your needs have entered a relationship that was organized around their comfort. The deeper cost of stopping is that you cannot control what others decide your boundary means. You can explain carefully and still be misunderstood. You can speak gently and still disappoint someone. You can act with integrity and still become the villain in a story another person needs to tell. This is the choice you have been avoiding. You must choose between being understood by everyone and remaining connected to yourself. You cannot guarantee both. Individuation requires the loss of certain forms of belonging. Jung did not romanticize this process. Becoming yourself is not a triumphant escape from relationship. It is the painful recognition that some connections were sustained by your willingness to remain divided against yourself. You may lose access to people who only felt close to you when you were carrying them. You may lose the identity of being indispensable. You may lose the moral innocence of believing that self-sacrifice always made you good. This is why the transition feels lonely. You are not merely changing a habit. You are withdrawing from an unconscious agreement. The agreement said that you would feel what others avoided, soften what others refused to take responsibility for, and abandon yourself before anyone else had the chance to feel abandoned by you. Breaking that agreement will cost you the version of peace that depended on silence. It may cost you relationships that never learned to survive mutuality. It may cost you the approval of people who loved your empathy as long as it never interfered with their access to you. There is no way to make this cost unreal, but you are allowed to stop paying for connection with your nervous system. You are allowed to notice another person's pain without entering it. You are allowed to let a message remain unanswered until you know what you genuinely want to say. You are allowed to hear disappointment in someone's voice and refuse to translate it into a verdict on your character. You are allowed to stop proving that your boundaries are reasonable to people who benefit from crossing them. This permission does not require you to become cold. Coldness is another defense. It is possible to remain tender without remaining permeable. It is possible to care deeply while recognizing that compassion does not demand fusion. Your sensitivity does not need to disappear. It needs a center. The center is the place within you that can witness another person's emotion and remain distinct from it. It does not deny what you perceive. It simply refuses to convert perception into responsibility without conscious choice. This is what changes when empathy becomes integrated. You no longer enter every room asking, "What does everyone need from you?" You begin asking, "What is happening inside you while you are here?" You no longer measure goodness by how little disruption you create. You begin measuring integrity by how faithfully your outer life reflects your inner truth. The accusation you once feared was that you were becoming less compassionate. The truth is more precise. You are becoming less available for emotional confusion. You are learning that love does not require you to carry what another person must eventually learn to hold. You are learning that someone else's sadness can be real without becoming your fault. You are learning that someone else's anger can be intense without becoming your instruction. You are learning that someone else's disappointment can exist without requiring your surrender. The moment you stop carrying everyone's emotions, you do not lose your gift. You finally discover what the gift was for. It was never meant to make you responsible for every wound you could sense. It was meant to help you perceive life clearly, without abandoning your own place within it. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you explore Carl Jung's psychology and the difficult path of becoming fully yourself. Watch the video on your screen now to understand what happens when an empath finally withdraws their energy.